Welcome back to Shocking Stories, where we uncover the most twisted true crime cases that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, love, and the dark secrets that lie buried in America's most historic cities. Today, we're taking you to the sultry, mysterious streets of New Orleans, Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs like secrets from ancient oak trees, and where the line between the living and the dead has always been blurrier than anywhere else in America. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to hear will shake you to your very core. This is the story of Armand Beauregard, a man whose name carried weight in New Orleans society for over 4 decades. At 78 years old, Armand was the patriarch of one of the city's oldest and wealthiest families, a man whose ancestors had built their fortune on cotton plantations before the Civil War and had somehow managed to maintain their wealth and influence through Reconstruction, the Great Depression, and into the modern era. The Beauregard family owned historic mansions in the Garden District, controlled shipping interests along the Mississippi River, and had their fingers in everything from real estate development to political campaigns. But on a humid September morning in 2023, Armand Beauregard was found dead in his study at the family's sprawling antebellum mansion on St. Charles Avenue, apparently having suffered a massive heart attack while reading in his favorite leather chair. He was discovered by Maria Santos, the family's housekeeper of 15 years, who had come to bring him his morning coffee and found him slumped over an old family photograph, his reading glasses askew and his face peaceful in death. Mr. Armand, he looked so serene, Maria later told investigators, crossing herself as she spoke, like he had finally found some peace. But there was something clutched in his hand, a little silver locket that I had never seen before. When I tried to open it to see what was inside, my hands were shaking so much I could barely manage it. Inside was a picture of a little boy with the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. The funeral of Armand Beauregard was a grand affair, as befitted a man of his stature in New Orleans society. The service was held at St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter, with hundreds of mourners, including politicians, business leaders, and society figures who had known the Beauregard family for generations. But notably absent from the proceedings were any immediate family members. Armand had never married, had no known children, and his only surviving relatives were distant cousins who lived in other states and had had little contact with him for decades. After the elaborate funeral and burial in the family crypt at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the reading of Armand's will took place in the offices of Bordelon, Thibodeau and Associates, the prestigious law firm that had handled the Beauregard family's legal affairs for over a century. Attorney Claude Bordelon, a dignified man in his 60s who had been Armand's personal lawyer for 20 years, gathered the small group of expected beneficiaries, a few distant relatives, several longtime employees, and representatives from the various charities that Armand had supported over the years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bordelon began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he opened the mahogany folder containing Armand's last will and testament. "Mr. Beauregard's final wishes are quite specific, and, I must say, rather unusual." The lawyer's voice carried a tone of barely concealed bewilderment as he continued. "According to this document, which was updated just 6 months ago, Mr. Beauregard has left his entire estate, valued at approximately $47 million, to a single beneficiary." The room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of New Orleans traffic. The distant relatives leaned forward in their chairs, expecting to hear one of their names called. The charity representatives prepared to take notes on their bequests. Maria Santos, who had been invited to the reading because of her long service to the family, clutched her purse nervously and wondered if Mr. Armand had remembered her in his will. "The sole heir to the Beauregard fortune," Bordelon continued, his voice growing even more puzzled, "is someone named Gabriel Beauregard. According to the will, Gabriel is described as Mr. Armand's beloved adopted son and the true heir to the family legacy." The lawyer paused and looked around the room at the confused faces staring back at him. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, that in all my years of representing Mr. Beauregard, he never mentioned having an adopted son. In fact, he always told me he had no children at all. The silence that followed was deafening. Distant cousin Margaret Thibodeau, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who had been expecting to inherit at least a portion of the estate, was the first to speak. "That's impossible," she declared, her voice rising with indignation. "Uncle Armand never had children. He was a confirmed bachelor his entire life. This Gabriel person, whoever he is, must be some kind of fraud trying to steal our family's legacy." But Claude Bordelon held up his hand for silence and continued reading from the will. According to Mr. Beauregard's instructions, Gabriel Beauregard currently resides at 1247 Burgundy Street in the Bywater neighborhood, and he should be contacted immediately regarding his inheritance. The will also states that Gabriel has been cared for and provided for by the Beauregard family since childhood, and that he is deserving of all the love and wealth that the family name carries. As the initial shock of the reading wore off, the practical questions began to emerge. Who was this Gabriel Beauregard? How had he come to be connected with the family? Why had Armand never mentioned him to anyone, including his lawyer and closest friends? And most importantly, was the will legitimate, or was this some elaborate fraud perpetrated by a stranger trying to steal a fortune? The investigation into Gabriel Beauregard's identity began immediately. Claude Bordelon, acting as executor of the estate, hired a private investigator named Detective Ray Hutchinson, a former New Orleans Police Department detective who specialized in background checks and genealogical research. Hutchinson was a tough, weathered man in his 50s who had seen everything in his 30 years of law enforcement. But even he was intrigued by the mystery of the phantom heir. "I've handled a lot of strange inheritance cases," Hutchinson later told reporters, "but I'd never seen anything quite like this. A man leaves his entire fortune to someone that nobody had ever heard of. Someone who supposedly lived just a few miles away, but had never been seen at family gatherings, social events, or anywhere else in Armand Beauregard's very public life." Hutchinson's first stop was 1247 Burgundy Street, a modest shotgun house in the Bywater neighborhood, a far cry from the opulent mansions of the Garden District where the Beauregard family traditionally lived. The house was neat and well maintained, with a small front porch and a garden full of native Louisiana plants. But it looked like the home of a working-class family, not the residence of someone who had just inherited $47 million. When Hutchinson knocked on the door, he was greeted by a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s, with dark hair, striking green eyes, and a gentle demeanor that seemed almost startled by the unexpected visitor. "Yes, sir?" the young man asked politely, his voice carrying just the faintest trace of a Creole accent that marked him as a true New Orleans native. "Are you Gabriel Beauregard?" Hutchinson asked, studying the young man's face carefully for any signs of deception or recognition. "Yes, sir, I am," Gabriel replied, his expression growing puzzled. "Is there something I can help you with?" Hutchinson later described that first meeting as one of the most surreal experiences of his career. Here was this kid, and he really did look like just a kid, maybe 22 or 23 years old, who had no idea that he had just inherited one of the largest fortunes in New Orleans. When I told him about Armand's death and the will, he didn't react with greed or excitement. He broke down crying and said that he'd been wondering why Papa Armand hadn't called him in a few weeks. Gabriel's reaction to the news was immediate and heartbreaking. He invited Hutchinson inside his modest home, which was filled with books, musical instruments, and artwork that suggested a cultured and educated young man despite his humble surroundings. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace was a collection of photographs showing Gabriel at various ages with an older man who was unmistakably Armand Beauregard. "Papa Armand was the only father I ever knew," Gabriel told Hutchinson through his tears. "He found me when I was very little and took care of me. He paid for this house, for my education, for everything I needed. He visited me every week and told me stories about our family history. I thought everyone knew about me." As Hutchinson examined the photographs more closely, he realized that they documented a relationship that had clearly lasted for many years. There were pictures of Gabriel as a small child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, holding Armand's hand in various locations around New Orleans. There were photos of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school graduations, and casual family moments that painted a picture of a loving relationship between a grandfather figure and his cherished child. But the more Hutchinson learned about Gabriel's background, the more questions arose. Gabriel had no birth certificate on file with the state of Louisiana. He had no social security number until he was 7 years old, when one was apparently obtained for him by Armand. He had no medical records from his early childhood and no documentation of how he had come to be in Armand's care. It was like Gabriel had appeared out of thin air when he was about 4 years old, Hutchinson explained. Before that, there was no paper trail, no records, nothing to indicate where he had come from or who his biological parents were. It was as if his life had begun the day Armand Beauregard decided to take him in. Gabriel himself claimed to have no memory of his life before coming to live with Armand. Papa Armand told me that my parents had died in an accident and that he was taking care of me because we were family, Gabriel said. I never questioned it because I was so young and Papa Armand was so kind to me. He said that someday, when I was older, he would tell me more about my real parents. But that day never came. The mystery deepened when Hutchinson discovered that Gabriel had been homeschooled for most of his childhood by a series of private tutors that Armand had hired. He had never attended public school, had never been part of the normal social networks that might have brought him to the attention of other members of New Orleans society. It was as if Armand had deliberately kept Gabriel hidden from the world, caring for him and educating him in secret while maintaining his public image as a childless bachelor. Armand had essentially created a parallel life, Hutchinson realized. He had this secret son that he loved and cared for, but he kept that part of his life completely separate from his public persona. The question was why? What was he hiding? And where had Gabriel really come from? The investigation took a dramatic turn when Hutchinson decided to run Gabriel's photograph through missing children databases. What he discovered would change everything about the case and expose a secret that had been buried for over 20 years. In the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database, he found a match that made his blood run cold. Gabriel Beauregard was actually Gabriel Rodriguez, a child who had been kidnapped from a shopping mall in Houston, Texas on March 15, 2003, when he was just 4 years old. The missing child poster showed the same distinctive green eyes, the same facial structure, and even the same shy smile that Gabriel displayed in his recent photographs. According to the file, Gabriel had been abducted while shopping with his mother, Carmen Rodriguez, a single parent who worked as a nurse at a Houston hospital. When I saw that missing child poster, everything clicked into place, Hutchinson later testified. This wasn't just a case of a secret inheritance. This was a case of child abduction that had gone unsolved for 2 decades. Armand Beauregard hadn't adopted Gabriel. He had kidnapped him. The revelation that Gabriel was actually a kidnapped child who had been missing for 20 years sent shockwaves through the New Orleans legal community and beyond. But even more shocking was what investigators discovered when they looked deeper into the circumstances of Gabriel's abduction and the connection between Armand Beauregard and the Rodriguez family. If you're as stunned by this revelation as I am, make sure to like this video and let me know in the comments whether you think Gabriel should inherit the money from his kidnapper. Don't forget to subscribe because in part 2, we're going to uncover the twisted connection between Armand Beauregard and Gabriel's real family and reveal why a wealthy New Orleans patriarch would kidnap a child and raise him as his own son. The truth is more disturbing than you could possibly imagine. Welcome back to Shocking Stories. When we left off, Detective Ray Hutchinson had made the shocking discovery that Gabriel Beauregard, the mysterious heir to a $47 million fortune, was actually Gabriel Rodriguez, a child who had been kidnapped from Houston, Texas, 20 years earlier. But as investigators dug deeper into the connection between Armand Beauregard and the Rodriguez family, they uncovered a web of secrets, lies, and tragedy that would expose the dark heart of a crime that had haunted 2 families for decades. The news that Gabriel Rodriguez had been found alive after 20 years hit his biological mother, Carmen Rodriguez, like a thunderbolt. Carmen, now 52 years old and working as a head nurse at Houston Methodist Hospital, had never given up hope that her son was still alive, despite the fact that most missing children cases that remain unsolved after the first 48 hours rarely have happy endings. For 2 decades, she had kept Gabriel's bedroom exactly as he had left it, had never missed a birthday or Christmas without buying him presents that she stored in his closet, and had spoken to countless reporters and investigators about her missing child. "I knew in my heart that Gabriel was still alive," Carmen told reporters through tears when she learned the news. "A mother knows these things. I never felt like he was gone forever. But to learn that he's been living just 4 hours away from me all this time, that he's been so close but I couldn't find him, it's devastating and wonderful at the same time." But Carmen's joy at learning her son was alive was quickly tempered by the revelation of who had taken him and why. When Detective Hutchinson showed her photographs of Armand Beauregard, Carmen's reaction was immediate and visceral. She gasped, turned pale, and had to sit down before she could speak. "That's him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the man who destroyed my family." The connection between Carmen Rodriguez and Armand Beauregard dated back to 1999, 4 years before Gabriel's kidnapping, when Carmen was working as a private duty nurse for Armand's older brother, Philippe Beauregard. Philippe had suffered a severe stroke and required round-the-clock medical care at the family's Garden District mansion. Carmen, who was known for her skill and compassion as a nurse, had been hired to provide that care. "Carmen was wonderful with Philippe," recalled Dr. Margaret Fontaine, the physician who had recommended Carmen for the position. "She was professional, caring, and completely dedicated to her patients' welfare." The whole Beauregard family seemed to appreciate her work, especially Armand, who visited his brother daily and always made a point of speaking with Carmen about Philippe's condition. But what started as a professional relationship between Carmen and Armand slowly developed into something more complex and troubling. Carmen later told investigators that Armand had seemed fascinated by her life outside of work, asking detailed questions about her family, her background, and especially about her young son Gabriel, who was then just a baby. "Mr. Armand was always asking about Gabriel," Carmen recalled. "He wanted to see pictures, to know what he was eating, how he was developing, whether he was walking or talking yet. At first, I thought he was just being kind, showing interest in my life. But looking back, I realized there was something obsessive about his questions." The situation became more uncomfortable when Armand began making what Carmen described as inappropriate offers to help with Gabriel's care and education. He suggested that Carmen bring Gabriel to work with her sometimes, offered to pay for expensive private schooling and medical care, and even proposed that Gabriel could live at the Beauregard mansion, where Carmen could care for both Philippe and her son. "I told him that was completely inappropriate," Carmen said. "I was there to take care of his brother, not to involve my personal life with the family. But Mr. Armand wouldn't let it go. He kept saying that Gabriel was a special child who deserved better opportunities than I could provide on a nurse's salary." The professional relationship came to an abrupt end in early 2000 when Philippe Beauregard died peacefully in his sleep. Carmen's services were no longer needed, and she returned to work at Houston Methodist Hospital. But Armand's interest in her family didn't end with his brother's death. Over the next 3 years, Carmen received periodic calls, letters, and even unexpected visits from Armand, all focused on Gabriel's welfare and development. He would show up at the hospital where I worked, asking how Gabriel was doing in school, whether he was happy, whether I was struggling financially, Carmen told investigators. He offered to set up college funds, to pay for medical expenses, to help in any way he could. It was creepy and inappropriate, but I didn't know how to make it stop. He was a powerful, wealthy man, and I was just a single mother trying to make ends meet. The stalking behavior escalated in 2002 when Armand began appearing at Gabriel's preschool, claiming to be a family friend
and asking teachers about the boy's progress and behavior. School administrators became concerned about the older man's unexplained interest in Gabriel and contacted Carmen, who immediately contacted the police and obtained a restraining order against Armand. "I should have taken more dramatic action," Carmen later said, her voice filled with regret. "But I was trying to handle it quietly, professionally. I didn't want to make waves or cause problems with such a prominent family. I thought the restraining order would be enough to make him leave us alone. I was wrong." The restraining order seemed to work for several months. Armand's calls and visits stopped, and Carmen began to hope that the nightmare was over. But on March 15, 2003, while shopping for Gabriel's 4th birthday party at a busy Houston mall, the unthinkable happened. Carmen was looking at birthday decorations when she turned around to find that Gabriel, who had been standing right beside her just moments before, had vanished. "One minute he was there, holding my hand and talking about his birthday cake," Carmen sobbed as she recounted the worst day of her life. "The next minute, he was gone. I looked everywhere, called his name, asked everyone if they had seen him. It was like he had just disappeared into thin air." The mall's security footage later showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses approaching Gabriel while Carmen was distracted by the birthday decorations. The man spoke to Gabriel briefly, then took his hand and led him toward an exit. The child went willingly, suggesting that he knew his abductor. The man's face was partially obscured by his disguise, but his height, build and mannerisms matched Armand Beauregard perfectly. "We knew immediately who had taken Gabriel," Carmen said, "but by the time we reviewed the security footage and put out an alert, they were already gone. Armand had a private plane and unlimited resources. He could have taken Gabriel anywhere in the world." Despite an extensive search involving the FBI, Texas State Police, and private investigators hired by Carmen's family, no trace of Gabriel or Armand was found. The case remained active but unsolved, and Carmen spent the next 20 years wondering what had happened to her son and whether she would ever see him again. Meanwhile, back in New Orleans, Armand was beginning his new life as Gabriel's adoptive father. Using his wealth and connections, he had created a completely new identity for the kidnapped child, obtaining falsified documents that showed Gabriel as an orphaned, distant relative who had come to live with the Beauregard family after his parents' deaths in a car accident. Armand was meticulous in creating Gabriel's new life. Detective Hutchinson discovered during his investigation he had birth certificates forged, created a false family history, and even manufactured photographs and documents that supported the story he had told Gabriel about his past. It was a complete identity replacement that would have been almost impossible to detect without modern DNA testing and database searches. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was how Armand had psychologically manipulated Gabriel to accept his new life and forget his real family. Child psychologist Dr. Sarah Chen, who was brought in to evaluate Gabriel after his identity was discovered, explained that young children are particularly vulnerable to this type of manipulation. Gabriel was only 4 years old when he was taken, Dr. Chen explained. At that age, children's memories are still developing, and they can be easily convinced that false memories are real. Armand essentially rewrote Gabriel's entire personal history, replacing his real memories with fabricated ones. It's a form of psychological abuse that can be extremely difficult to undo. The investigation revealed that Armand had used a combination of isolation, constant storytelling, and even mild sedatives to help Gabriel forget his previous life and accept his new identity. Gabriel was homeschooled to prevent him from being exposed to other children who might trigger memories of his real past, and Armand carefully controlled every aspect of his environment to reinforce the false narrative he had created. It was like a form of brainwashing, Dr. Chen continued. Armand created a completely artificial reality for Gabriel and then maintained that reality for 20 years. The fact that Gabriel never questioned his false history is a testament to how thoroughly Armand had manipulated his psychological development. But even more disturbing was the discovery of Armand's motivations for kidnapping Gabriel. A search of Armand's personal papers and computer files revealed a man who had become obsessed with the idea of having a family legacy to carry on the Beauregard name. Despite his public persona as a confirmed bachelor, Armand had apparently been desperately lonely and had fixated on Carmen's son as the perfect child to fulfill his paternal fantasies. Armand's journals from that period show a man who was deeply troubled and increasingly delusional, explained FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Michael Torres, who was brought in to profile the case. He had convinced himself that he could provide a better life for Gabriel than Carmen could, and that taking the child was actually an act of rescue rather than kidnapping. It's a common rationalization among child abductors. They convince themselves that they're saving the child from an inferior situation. The journals also revealed that Armand had been monitoring Carmen and Gabriel for months before the kidnapping, learning their routines, studying Gabriel's behavior, and planning the perfect moment to take the child. He had even hired private investigators to follow Carmen and report on Gabriel's development and activities. This wasn't an impulsive crime, Dr. Torres observed. This was a carefully planned abduction by a man who had the resources and patience to execute a perfect crime. The fact that he managed to hide Gabriel's true identity for 20 years shows just how methodical and calculating he was. As news of Gabriel's true identity spread, the case became a media sensation that raised complex questions about justice, family, and the long-term effects of childhood trauma. Carmen Rodriguez flew to New Orleans immediately upon learning that her son was alive, but their reunion was complicated by the fact that Gabriel had no memory of his real mother and considered Armand Beauregard to be his only family. It was heartbreaking, Carmen later told reporters. I looked at this young man who was clearly my son. He had my father's eyes and my brother's smile, but he looked at me like I was a complete stranger. 20 years of his life had been stolen from both of us, and I didn't know if we could ever get that back.
The legal implications of the case were equally complex. Gabriel was legally entitled to his biological mother's love and support, but he was also the heir to a fortune that had been left to him by his kidnapper. Should he be allowed to inherit money from the man who had destroyed his real family? Did Armand's crimes invalidate his will? And what responsibility did Gabriel bear for crimes he had been too young to understand or prevent? This case challenges everything we think we know about justice and family relationships, said legal expert Professor Janet Williams of Tulane University Law School. Gabriel is both a victim and a beneficiary of the same crime. He lost his real family, but gained a fortune. How do you calculate the damages in a situation like that? But even as lawyers and ethicists debated the legal implications of the case, a more shocking revelation was about to emerge. As investigators continued to dig into Armand's past and his connection to the Rodriguez family, they discovered evidence that Gabriel might not have been Armand's only victim. Hidden in the basement of the Beauregard mansion, police found files and photographs that suggested Armand had been stalking other families and other children for decades. In Part 3, we'll reveal the full scope of Armand Beauregard's crimes and explore the question that haunted everyone involved in the case. How many other families had been destroyed by the twisted obsessions of a man who used his wealth and power to steal children and remake them in his own image? Don't forget to like this video if you're as shocked as I am by these revelations, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the explosive conclusion to this incredible case. Share this video to help raise awareness about the lasting effects of child abduction. And let me know in the comments whether you think Gabriel should keep his inheritance or return it to his biological family. The final part of this story will reveal secrets that will change everything you think you know about the Beauregard family legacy. Welcome back to the shocking conclusion of our investigation into the twisted Beauregard inheritance case. When we left off, investigators had uncovered evidence that Armand Beauregard might have victimized other families beyond Gabriel Rodriguez and his mother Carmen. What they discovered in the basement of the Beauregard mansion would expose a decades-long pattern of obsession, manipulation, and child theft that reached back to the very foundations of the family's wealth and power. The search of Armand Beauregard's mansion was conducted by a joint task force
of FBI agents, New Orleans police detectives, and specialists from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What they found hidden behind a false wall in the mansion's basement was what investigators later described as a shrine to stolen childhood, a collection of files, photographs, and personal items documenting what appeared to be a systematic pattern of child abduction spanning over 30 years. "I've been investigating crimes against children for 15 years, said FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, who led the search team. "But I've never seen anything like what we found in that basement. It was like a museum dedicated to kidnapped children, with each case meticulously documented and preserved." The files contained detailed information on over a dozen families that Armand had apparently stalked and studied, all with young children who fit a specific profile. Boys between the ages of 3 and 6, from working-class families, often with single mothers who were struggling financially. Each file contained photographs taken from a distance, copies of school records, medical information, and detailed notes about the children's daily routines and family situations. But most disturbing of all were the files that contained what appeared to be before and after photographs, pictures of children in their original families, followed by images of those same children living new lives with different identities and different families. Gabriel's file was just one of many, and investigators realized that what they had initially thought was an isolated crime was actually part of a much larger pattern of systematic child theft. Armand Beauregard wasn't just a lonely man who kidnapped one child, Agent Santos explained. He was running what amounted to a private adoption agency, stealing children from poor families and placing them with wealthy people who were willing to pay for the service and ask no questions. Gabriel was just the child he decided to keep for himself. The investigation expanded dramatically as agents worked to identify the other children in the files and determine their current whereabouts. What they discovered was a network of wealthy individuals across the South who had adopted children through Armand's services, no questions asked, in exchange for substantial payments to offshore accounts controlled by the Beauregard family. It was like a black market adoption ring, but instead of working with birth mothers who were voluntarily placing their children, Armand was stealing children from families who desperately wanted to keep them, explained Dr. Patricia Moore, a family psychologist who was brought in to counsel the victims. He was essentially commodifying childhood, turning stolen children into luxury goods for wealthy people who couldn't or wouldn't adopt through legitimate channels. The scope of Armand's crimes became clearer as investigators identified some of the other victims. There was Marcus Thompson, taken from a playground in Atlanta in 1987 and raised by a wealthy textile manufacturer, and his wife, who believed they were adopting an orphan from a tragic car accident. There was Isabella Chen, kidnapped from a shopping center in Miami in 1994 and given to a pharmaceutical executive and his wife, who had been told she was the daughter of drug addicts who had died of overdoses. Each case followed the same pattern. Armand would identify vulnerable families with young children, study their routines and weaknesses, then orchestrate carefully planned abductions. The children would be given new identities and placed with wealthy couples who paid substantial fees for what they believed were legitimate private adoptions of children from tragic circumstances. The families who received these children genuinely believed they were saving orphans, Dr. Moore explained. Armand created elaborate backstories for each child, complete with forged documents and false family histories. The adoptive families had no reason to suspect they were participating in kidnapping schemes. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was that Armand's crimes dated back to the 1970s and appeared to have been started by his own father, Philippe Beauregard Sr., the family patriarch who had built the foundation of the family's modern wealth. Documents found in the mansion's safe revealed that the private adoption service had been a Beauregard family business for 2 generations, providing wealthy families with children while generating millions of dollars in revenue for the family's various legitimate businesses. It appears that stealing children was how the Beauregard family rebuilt their fortune
after losing most of their wealth in the early 20th century, said financial investigator Robert Liu, who traced the family's financial records. They realized that wealthy people would pay enormous sums for healthy, intelligent children, and they developed a system to provide that service while maintaining complete secrecy and plausible deniability. The revelation that Gabriel was part of a decades-long family business of child trafficking added another layer of complexity to his legal situation. Not only was he the victim of a kidnapping, but he was also the heir to a fortune that had been built, at least in part, on the systematic theft and sale of children like himself. Carmen Rodriguez, Gabriel's biological mother, struggled with the knowledge that her son's kidnapping was part of a much larger criminal enterprise. "It's bad enough that one sick man stole my child," she told reporters through tears. "But to learn that this was a family business, that there were other mothers like me who lost their children to these monsters, it's almost too much to bear." The legal proceedings that followed were unprecedented in their complexity. Gabriel found himself at the center of multiple lawsuits, criminal investigations, and ethical debates that would ultimately reshape how society thinks about inheritance, victimhood, and justice. The first major legal question was whether Gabriel could inherit money from his kidnapper. Prosecutors argued that allowing him to keep the inheritance would essentially reward Armand's crimes and could set a dangerous precedent for other criminals who might try to use inheritance laws to benefit their victims. But Gabriel's lawyers argued that he was an innocent victim who had no knowledge of or responsibility for Armand's crimes, and that punishing him for his kidnapper's actions would amount to victimizing him a second time. Gabriel didn't choose to be kidnapped, argued his attorney Sarah Chen. He didn't choose to have his identity stolen or his memories manipulated. He was a 4-year-old child who became the victim of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. To deny him his inheritance because of crimes he was powerless to prevent would be a grave injustice. But the situation became even more complicated when other victims and their families filed lawsuits claiming that Gabriel's inheritance should be divided among all of Armand's victims as compensation for their suffering. Marcus Thompson, now 42 and working as a teacher in Georgia, argued that Gabriel had no more right to the Beauregard fortune than any of the other children who had been stolen and trafficked by the family. "We were all victims of the same crime," Thompson said during a court hearing. "The only difference is that Gabriel was kept by the kidnapper while the rest of us were sold to other families. If anyone deserves compensation from this blood money, it's all of us equally." The case was further complicated by the fact that some of the other victims didn't want to be rescued from their current lives. Isabella Chen, now 35 and living in California with the family that had raised her, had built a successful career and strong relationships with her adoptive family. She had no memory of her biological parents and no desire to reconnect with them. "I understand that I was kidnapped as a child," Isabella said in a statement released through her lawyers. "But the family that raised me loved me and gave me a good life. I don't want to destroy the only family I've ever known just to satisfy other people's ideas about justice." The psychological evaluation of Gabriel became a crucial element in determining his legal status and future. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who had been working with Gabriel since his identity was discovered, testified that his psychological development had been severely impacted by his kidnapping and the decades of identity manipulation he had endured. "Gabriel is suffering from what we call identity displacement disorder," Dr. Chen explained to the court. "His sense of self, his memories, and his understanding of family relationships have all been artificially constructed by his abductor. He doesn't know who he really is or where he belongs. The question of inheritance is almost secondary to the question of how to help him rebuild an authentic identity." Gabriel himself struggled with the competing claims on his loyalty and affection. In court testimony that moved observers to tears, he described his conflicted feelings about Armand, Carmen, and his uncertain future. "Papa Armand was the only father I ever knew,
Gabriel said, his voice barely audible. "He was kind to me. He loved me. He gave me everything I needed. I know now that he stole me from my real mother, and I know that was wrong. But I can't just erase 20 years of love and memories because I've learned they were built on a lie." Gabriel also struggled with his relationship with Carmen, who desperately wanted to rebuild the mother-son bond that had been stolen from them both. "I look at Carmen and I know she's my biological mother," Gabriel continued. "I can see the resemblance, and I understand the pain she suffered because of what happened to me, but I don't remember her. I don't feel that connection that a son should feel with his mother. I want to love her the way she loves me, but I don't know how to get past the wall that Armand built in my mind." The court proceedings dragged on for months as lawyers, judges, and expert witnesses struggled to address questions that had never been faced before in American legal history. How do you compensate victims of crimes that were committed decades earlier? How do you restore families that have been destroyed by sophisticated psychological manipulation? How do you distribute wealth that was accumulated through criminal activity over multiple generations? The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source: Gabriel himself. After months of therapy and legal proceedings, Gabriel announced that he had made a decision about his inheritance that he hoped would bring some measure of justice and closure to all of the victims of the Beauregard family's crimes. "I've decided to establish a foundation using the Beauregard inheritance," Gabriel announced at a press conference attended by Carmen, other victims, and their families. "The foundation will provide financial support, counseling services, and legal assistance to families who have been affected by child abduction and trafficking. It will also fund research into better methods for identifying and reuniting kidnapped children with their biological families." Gabriel's decision was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded his generosity and his attempt to turn a criminal legacy into a force for good. Others argued that he was still benefiting from his kidnappers' crimes, even if he was using the money for charitable purposes. But most of the other victims and their families supported Gabriel's plan, seeing it as the best possible outcome from an impossible situation. Gabriel found a way to honor both his biological family and his complicated relationship with Armand, said Marcus Thompson. "He's turning blood money into something that might prevent other families from going through what we all experienced. That takes courage and wisdom that most people his age don't have." Carmen Rodriguez's relationship with Gabriel remained complicated but gradually improved as they worked together on the foundation. "We'll never have the mother-son relationship that was stolen from us," Carmen said during an interview a year after Gabriel's identity was revealed. "But we're building something new together, something that honors both the family he came from and the man he's become. It's not what I dreamed of for 20 years, but it's real, and it's ours." The Gabriel Rodriguez Foundation, as it came to be known, has since helped dozens of families affected by child abduction and has funded research that has led to improved techniques for identifying and recovering missing children. The foundation also maintains the Beauregard Mansion as a residential facility for families who are dealing with the aftermath of child abduction and recovery. Gabriel took the worst possible legacy and turned it into something that helps other people, said Dr. Patricia Moore, who serves on the foundation's board of directors. It's a testament to his character and his resilience that he was able to create something positive from such a traumatic and complicated situation. The criminal investigation into the Beauregard family's trafficking network continued long after Gabriel's case was resolved. Prosecutors filed charges against several individuals who had knowingly participated in the adoption scheme, though many of the original conspirators had died of old age before they could be brought to justice. The investigation also led to the identification and recovery of several other victims who had been living under false identities for decades. As our investigation into the twisted Beauregard inheritance concludes, we're left with profound questions about family, identity, and the long-lasting effects of childhood trauma. Gabriel Rodriguez's story reminds us that the victims of crimes are often forced to carry burdens that extend far beyond the original criminal act. and that justice sometimes requires creative solutions that acknowledge the complexity of human relationships and the irreversible nature of certain types of harm. "This case changed how I think about justice," said Detective Ray Hutchinson, who continued to work with the foundation after his retirement from private investigation. "Sometimes the goal isn't to restore things to the way they were before the crime occurred, because that's impossible. Sometimes the goal is to find a way forward that honors both the suffering that was caused and the human connections that developed despite that suffering." Gabriel's story also highlights the importance of continued vigilance in protecting children from predators who use wealth, power, and sophistication to commit crimes that can remain hidden for decades. The techniques used by the Beauregard family, identity manipulation, psychological conditioning, and the exploitation of legitimate adoption systems, continue to be used by modern criminals who traffic in children. "We can't bring back the 20 years that Gabriel and his mother lost," said FBI Special Agent Maria Santos. "But we can learn from this case and use that knowledge to protect other families from similar crimes." Gabriel's courage in speaking out about his experience and his decision to use his inheritance to help other victims has already made a difference in how we investigate and respond to child trafficking cases. If this incredible story has moved you as much as it has moved us, please like this video and share it to help raise awareness about child trafficking and the importance of supporting survivors. Subscribe to Shocking Stories for more investigations that expose the hidden crimes that shape our society. And remember that behind every shocking headline is a human story of survival, resilience, and the search for justice. Gabriel Rodriguez's journey from kidnapped child to heir to advocate reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, it's possible to find ways to honor both our past and our future. His story may have begun with a crime, but his response to that crime has become a beacon of hope for other families who are struggling to rebuild their lives after unimaginable loss. The twisted inheritance of the Beauregard family may have been built on a foundation of stolen children and broken families, but Gabriel's decision to transform that legacy into a force for healing and protection shows that even the most corrupted inheritance can be redeemed through courage, compassion, and the determination to ensure that others don't suffer the same fate.